My name's Trevor Moffat. I'm based at the Improvement Service, and this is a Planning Skills webinar looking at addressing key challenges in rural housing. I am joined today by three people who know a lot about rural housing, a lot more than me, and that's Debbie Mackay, the Director and Head of Savills North Planning Team, David Stewart, the Policy and Practice Lead at the Scottish Land Commission, and Jonathan Guthrie, the Director for Strategic Partnerships at the Robertson Group.
And thank you for the chance to speak today. And more than that, I think I'm looking forward to having a really good dialogue with everybody who's attending. So it'd be great if you could do questions and comments and inputs, because we have a lot to learn from each other. I will give a particular viewpoint today, which will be much more from the point of view of someone dealing with the planning system as an applicant or on behalf of others as an applicant, but also as someone who has lived in a variety of rural areas in two countries and therefore have a lot of stuff to draw on to add to what I'm saying today. So let's get going. Try to get my slide to change. I think it has now. So I thought it might be quite useful just to establish my credentials as regards rural areas. I grew up in South Armagh, Northern Ireland, in a rural yet relatively accessible area, as everywhere is in Northern Ireland. I spent the first 12 years of my career working in Argyll and Bute Council in economic development, European policy. So that was an in-depth experience of living and working in a remote rural area. Experiencing and witnessing the wonderful quality of life you can have in these stunning areas and the really interesting and diverse career you can have as well, but also the huge challenges of finding housing. So I had a brief sojourn in Edinburgh, then spent quite a few years in the rural part of East Lothian, and clearly much of this area was accessible rural with very tight planning policies. Now I live in what I would say is an accessible rural part of Stirlingshire. So I've experienced the range of issues which impact on parts of Scotland and have the contrast of what rural means in Ireland too. Because housing is such a challenging topic in rural areas, I've been drawn over the years to get involved as a Director of Rural Housing Scotland, a charity which supported communities to develop affordable rural housing, and David and I sat on the board there. So hearing from the staff and members of Rural Housing Scotland has given me some startling insights into what rural homelessness looks like, and also the incredible innovations which are happening across Scotland in community provision of affordable housing primarily. But in great irony, given the rural housing crisis, RHS had to close just before Christmas due to the lack of core funding, but that's another story for another day. And I also sit in the National Policy Board of Scottish Land and Estates, which are providing advice on planning and housing matters to their members. I've had the privilege of working one of these with David as my client on two research studies in recent years, although the years are going on. One was Rural Planning Policy to 2050, which was for Scottish Government, and it was designed to influence MPS4's planning policies. The other was the role of land in enabling new housing supply in rural Scotland for the Scottish Land Commission. Returning to Ireland for a minute, just to give some context, Ireland is frequently cited as being an example of bad rural planning, the fear of mansions in the countryside. And I would agree that there were parts of Ireland, particularly in the run-up to the 2008 financial crash, where house building was excessive and rural areas were suffering in hotspot locations. But I think the Irish example has been overplayed, and the upsides of allowing growth in the countryside are not recognised. Please indulge me while I reflect on why rural housing has become a driver for me in life and why it matters so much for rural vibrancy. I can point to two big Damascus Road moments. Firstly, as a young planner back from first year in uni in Dundee, I was complaining to my dad about all the housing that seemed to be cropping up in every field around our home in rural South Armagh. My dad turned to me in genuine shock and said, "But is it not great to see the young people doing so well?" And I suddenly realised a lot of things in that moment. And that gave me a really different perspective on what rural housing means and symbolises. My dad was born in 1929. I think he had that fear of loss of young people from the area sort of built into his psyche. And probably not unlike the role that the clearances play in the Scottish consciousness. So the potato famine and the exodus from Ireland that prompted, and many other waves of exiles, does leave quite a deep imprint in our both of our countries. So to my dad, houses being built in the countryside meant young people were prospering and were able to stay. And the proof of that is that my home community today is bustling and lively. It's a wide age demographic. It's got lots of clubs and activities, lots of small and bigger businesses going on. And my nieces and nephews can go off to university and spread their wings. And yet going back home to work and live is an entirely doable option for them. And it is one that they want. They see their home community as an attractive and viable place to work and live. Now, I do know we have to be careful with policy tourism, and there are factors which make Ireland different to Scotland, but the principle that houses mean people can stay, people can come back, people can flourish remains the same. The second Damascus Road experience was a young planner working for Argyll Butte Council. I was involved in a trip to Colonsay as part of the Initiative on the Edge programme, when a group of officials went out in their suits to hear what the people of Colonsay felt their island needed to make it more viable. I was expecting to hear about employment opportunities and transport as the top issues, but the first thing on everyone's lips was housing. They spoke of the inability to expand their businesses because there was nowhere for workers to live on the island. They spoke of losing their children to the mainland because of the lack of housing for them to return to. There was no lack of economic opportunities if only they had the housing. I'm sure every one of you, no matter where you live in Scotland, can think of a rural business which you and your children love and enjoy regularly. These businesses can't survive without staff, and staff need housing. Some rural businesses could prosper and expand if a further house on the farm was allowed to enable the next generation to come back and develop more business activities. That's just one example. And the capital injection that the sale of a house plot might give could boost business expansion and increase rural economic resilience. So rural farms, shops and cafes can be part of the solution to rural livability questions, and I'll share an example later. I mentioned the two rural research projects I was involved in. One of the big but not unexpected findings was that housing has a fundamental role in relation to the sustainability of rural communities. Housing was recognised as transformational because of its centrality to the wider prospects of an area. Its significance relates to supporting schools and services, providing a local workforce, giving people the opportunity to develop businesses, enabling succession in these businesses, and retaining and attracting economically active people. But we are witnessing across Scotland a perfect storm blowing through rural areas, which is rapidly diminishing their mainstream housing stock. This storm includes well-intentioned but misguided policies, the rapid increase in building and material costs, infrastructure costs and challenges, second home growth, conversions to holiday accommodation, and competition from wealthy house purchasers not relying on local income, and NIMBY attitudes to housing. Since we did these studies, some new factors have increased the pressure. The hugely significant opportunities for natural capital across rural Scotland require more people living on the land, managing the land. And that's not to mention things like the Green Freeport and the growth in renewable energy. So why does this matter? Well, 98% of Scotland is classified by Scottish Government as rural. And this map graphically brings the 98% home. It's a case of spot the red and yellow urban areas in that vast sea of green land. The total land mass of Scotland is approximately 7.8 million hectares, but rural Scotland only accounts for 17% of the total population in Scotland. Our population density is 70 people per square kilometre compared to England's 434. We have a huge rural hinterland which is rapidly depopulating in places, and we have a potentially massive opportunity to maximise our already considerable renewable energy and natural capital resources to meet biodiversity and carbon capture aims. But to do this, we need people living and thriving in rural Scotland. You would probably have had to be living under a rock over the last year not to hear that Scotland has a housing crisis. We did a quick trawl and found about 13 councils that have declared either a housing crisis or a housing challenge. Homes for Scotland did a detailed survey recently and found that 693,000 households, or 1/4 of Scottish households, face one or more forms of housing need. Currently, assessments of housing need just typically really look at overcrowded households or homeless households in temporary accommodation, but that drastically underestimates the real need. So of the 693,000 households found by Homes of Scotland, the types of housing need range from concealed households, households struggling financially due to high housing costs, living in overcrowded accommodation, living in properties that do not have specialised adaptations, living in unfit properties, and homelessness or in temporary accommodation. Our current strategic housing investment plans and HNDAs are not fine-grained enough to cope with the low population densities of rural Scotland, and so much housing need in rural areas goes unreported. To take forward rural housing projects requires the use of local housing needs surveys to get under the skin of the local situations. Various Ipsos Mori polls show that concerns over housing have doubled amongst the public over the last 3 years. So we are definitely in a housing crisis. So there's a huge need, but there's also huge opportunities generated by housing. Again, Homes for Scotland produced a report in 2022 entitled The Social and Economic Benefits of Home Building in Scotland. And the report details the complex and interconnected ways in which home building impacts positively on Scottish people and society. And broadly, this positive impact was categorised under the themes of inclusivity, quality of life, environmental sustainability, and economic growth. And the report goes into that in great detail, and I would really recommend a read of that. But one example of the backup stats is that every one direct construction job generates a 0.5 additional job in the Scottish economy. New house building will provide a contribution to tax revenues through local council tax, national level land and building transaction tax, corporation tax, and VAT on certain parts of the build process. But the economic impacts are much, much wider than that. And again, I really recommend the study. The Scottish Government Housing to 2040 document states that housing's unique place at the heart of thriving communities means that investment in housing and all the indirect effects that flow from that can contribute to community wealth and social renewal. Interestingly, 2040 is really the end of the currency of the first wave of our new style LDPs. So local authority planners have this, me, all of us have this opportunity to make sure all those benefits flow to Scotland from having a positive attitude to rural housing and the policies to match. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Studies already done have a wealth of great ideas in them. I'm particularly proud of this one, but that is more to do with our excellent client and my colleague Graham Reid, who did a huge amount of work on this. He's now Chief Executive at Scotia Homes. But some key recommendations relating to planning in particular include a provision of a suite of rural focused planning policies in NPF4 and then in local development plans. I would say these recommendations are very variably witnessed. We see hugely inconsistent approaches to rural housing policy and implementation across planning authorities, and an attitude of presumption against rural housing being exercised. Regarding NPF4, let's take a closer look. You will all know well that NPF4 is fundamentally devoted to the twin climate and biodiversity crises. This is deeply necessary and totally laudable as it is, but it forgot another crisis, and that was housing. And it has in turn created major challenges across the housing sector. When it comes to rural housing, NPF4 is particularly weak. Opportunities like housing clusters are missing from the key policy 17. It's got an over-reliance on allocations, and the issues of constrained supply which this creates is really significant also for rural areas. There are local living trip-ups, which we've seen very crudely applied, and I'll mention that more later. And the read across from other policies can nullify any positivity that you might eke out of the rural policies. Public transport requirements are unrealistically applied, but more of this later. So our experience across Scotland is that local planning authorities are using NPF4 policies on rural housing and combining them with local living and infrastructure first policies to refuse houses in the countryside. That's why I put this NPF4 policy disconnect up. A lot of this obviously comes from this kind of inbuilt fear of a suburbanisation of the countryside. And again, I think that's vastly overplayed when you look at the scale of Scotland's rural areas. We have a focus on affordable only, and I'll come back to that. we do have, and this is a problem across the board really, isn't it, inexperienced planning staff. We have consultee overreach, and the housing emergency and economic impact do not appear to be being used as material considerations. I would contend that we lack a vision for how we might support rural areas confidently to grow and become sustainable. Instead, we feed the current spatial pattern, which feeds, in turn, heavy centralisation and actively promotes depopulation. Planning for rural areas driven by this fear of suburbanisation, and tiny developments are forced to to comply with reams of policy requirements completely disproportionate to the impact of the proposal. As well as taking no active account of the benefits of housing to balance against the hypothetical impacts, we also see this focus on affordable housing only instead of a generous supply and approach to policy interpretation to allow a range of types of housing to come forward. Smaller applications for rural housing are left to less experienced planners who typically take a procedural and policy tick box approach, overly influenced by consultees who can obsess about their specific area of expertise. Don't get me started on trees. More senior experienced people, understandably, are just so busy because of the scarcity of resources and the really significant amount of applications going forward to give smaller applications the attention needed. So it appears to be that no is a default. Whereas a professional planner, I would argue, needs to be able to step back and look at the whole of the situation. And given all the needs and benefits of housing, the balance should be in favour of finding ways to say yes. We see no evidence as yet of the housing emergency or need for repopulation being treated as material considerations. The work we undertook for Scottish Government and rural planning policies was clear. Rural housing is transformational and is in itself infrastructure, and we have to start really thinking of it like that. I would argue also that the whole planning system spends far too much time worrying about rural homes. To the detriment of resource across the board, applications seem to be assessed with a fine-tooth comb to find reasons to refuse when they could be treated with much greater generosity, given again the level of impact they're likely to have. But planning departments in rural areas are very innovative. An example I admired, and I had no involvement in the initiation of it, though I did have some involvement in making it happen, was the Argyll and Buttes area capacity evaluations. These gave planners the tools and at that time the training to assess whether a landscape had capacity for new development. And in Savills, we've been developing a new approach to site selection for housing at all scales using a natural capital assessment layered with landscape considerations, which could be a really helpful way forward, considering human habitats alongside nature and carbon. Argyll and Butte also developed a suite of rural housing guidance, which encouraged the design of modern vernacular approaches to siting and design on the principle that instead of hiding new housing in the countryside, it should be fit to be seen and actually enhance the landscape. There are great solutions out there, great practice across rural communities, and they need supported to the hilt by planning policies and changes in planning culture. In this study for Scottish Land Commission, we looked at a case study in Applecross, one of the most remote areas in Scotland with dispersed township communities living beside and within a large single ownership and in significant need of housing. Through a collaborative process engaging the community, the landowner, the planning authority, public agencies, PAS assisted the partners to develop a community land use plan. It really was an early local place plan. Highland Council were specifically praised for their policy team's level of engagement with this process. And the process developed a settlement pattern, which may not look like a conventional, accessible rural area form, but it respects the unique land form and known local conditions to produce its own version near to the core village of a 20-minute neighbourhood. It also dealt with the wider rural hinterland across the Applecross community and brought out opportunities for sympathetic development more broadly. Could something like this plan become a master plan consent area? That might avoid the danger of inconsistent attitudes across planning policy and development management to potentially speed up delivery, one for our discussion later. Another exciting concept being pioneered in Perthshire at Comrie Croft and on the Isle of Lewis is that of the Smart Clachan, a new housing initiative for modern life in rural locations. Smart Clachan, 21st century revival of the traditional Scottish Clachan, community-based initiatives to support repopulation by creating affordable housing and shared facilities, which enable new households to remain, return and settle. They take the built form of a Clachan and utilise community-led cooperative housing. The community ethos is fostered through shared services and facilities. The most frequently quoted reasons for concern over supporting rural housing is the pressure they may put on public services. We have to balance against this the depletion in local services that is actually being driven by housing scarcity. We need to have an expansionist view which seeks to drive local repopulation, taking risks to allow growth and innovation to happen. A worrying trend highlighted to me recently was that councils may be choosing to close rural schools to help meet carbon reduction targets. This is in direct contradiction to the need to address repopulation and make rural areas more sustainable by supporting existing services, particularly with housing. We do need greater research and innovation to support rural areas in driving this out, but we mustn't be drivers of decline and depopulation as a planning profession. Rural farm shops and cafes I mentioned earlier can be part of the solution to rural livability questions. Humby Hub is a lovely example of this in East Lothian, a tiny village, but enlivened by a shop, post office, cafe, self-catering and business units. And then, yes, indeed, one house that went along with them. Very successful operation there. And also, I'm really just relieved and pleased to see the new wave of banking hubs in rural areas. So what might make a difference? We need Scottish Government to provide greater support to planning authorities. In particular, I would argue we need another Chief Planner letter, clarifying NPF4 and rural areas, encouraging a positive attitude and a balanced approach, even a presumption in favour, with place-specific approaches being applied. We really need NPF4 policies to be reviewed. We need to address the triple crises. We need to facilitate rural Scotland to deliver on climate change and biodiversity enhancement. We need policies that support market housing in rural areas to cross-subsidise affordable housing and allow some forms of remote enabling. But I think overall we really need a working group focus on planning and infrastructure. I know PIPAG is doing quite a lot on this to address delivery at scale. And I think Scottish Government really needs to give planning authorities the backup to innovate. All of this should then signal to local members that rural areas can be given room to breathe. And in many areas, local members understand this issue all too well. My colleague was at the South of Scotland Enterprise launch yesterday of its housing prospectus, and councillors who spoke said that the housing was the #1 issue flooding their inboxes. They spoke specifically of local people keen to move back to the area, but severely constrained housing supply was stopping them, not employment opportunities. So planning, I recognise absolutely, is only one part of this picture, and other processes are definitely at play. But planning has the scope to be a huge part of the solution. But we definitely should not be adding to the crisis. But I am keen to hear from you as to what is being done and what could be done to tackle this issue at a local authority level. We're each asking a question at the end of our talks, so I couldn't resist having a group of planners in the virtual room. Can I present this provocation? Why does the planning system fear rural housing? Or what does the planning system fear about rural housing is probably a better way to put it. Jonathan and David's questions will build on this one and will be more positively framed, I promise you. But we thought it was vital to probe this question first. You may, of course, completely disagree with my premise, but we can discuss that later. I'll now hand you back to Trevor. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Debbie. I've made the questions live already, so we've already got some answers in. You'll be able to see on your screen if you can read that now. Yes, we did ask what the planning system fear about rural housing. Someone's already said no fear, so that's good.
I love that one.
That's wrong, but yeah, there's quite a few common themes being brought up, and I'm sure people will be updating it as we go. But a few that have been raised already were urbanisation of the countryside, inadequate or inappropriate supply of housing, strain on infrastructure, unsustainable travel, loss of character, and putting housing in the wrong place. I'll scroll through these as well, but I don't know if you've got anything else to say, if you were expecting some of those answers, or what you might have been expecting from posing this question.
These great answers, but they are answers I've been hearing for my entire career. And I would just really challenge people to think we as planners have the tools to do this well and positively. And we have to kind of break out of the mindset that I think is driven by an urban attitude to planning. And our urban attitude to planning are coming from our origins in the southeast of England, where planning has kind of crept its way north with this fear of suburbanization. What I would say is get the sense of the scale in our heads is hugely, hugely important. When you look at Scotland's sparse population and the opportunities that it offers, the economic opportunities are enormous. I didn't have time to go into this, but Highlands Islands Enterprise and South of Scotland Enterprise have been publishing and doing a lot of work on the enormous opportunities that are coming in rural areas. And it's unparalleled probably in any of our lifetimes, the amount of activity in renewable energy and in natural capital deals going on. And I think Dumfries and Galloway and Borders have this Borders version of the growth deal. So we've got this window where we have to really spring forward and give Scotland's rural areas the scope to actually breathe and grow and meet their potential.
Thanks, Debbie. You mentioned a few publications there as well. I've said in the chat, anything that's mentioned today, any publications you should be aware of, I'll send out in the follow-up email too. I'll also condense this feedback and send it out because there's some good points being made. We can't go through all of them just now, but I'll pick up those as we go through. Just aware of the time, and I'll bring David Stewart from the Scottish Land Commission in now. If you want to share your slides, David.
Thanks very much, Trevor, and thanks everyone for the opportunity. I'm very much looking forward to both the chance to share our work with you today, but I think more importantly to get your feedback and views. And I think from a prior discussion, all of us on the panel hope this can be more the start of a conversation and some joint work rather than just a one-off event. So what I'm going to talk about today, it won't surprise you, it's very much focused on the role of land in enabling housing and our analysis of the way that the housing land market works, and particularly the rural housing land market. And I suppose really just to set out my stall, and in a way, if you don't remember anything else about the talk today, in our view from our research, really the challenge around rural housing in Scotland is that volume house builders build the vast majority of housing in Scotland, whether that's for sale or some form of affordable housing, but really outside hotspots close to strong market areas, such as this example of Innerleithen in the Scottish Borders, which is commutable by Edinburgh, or similarly than our Murray Firth area that's close to Inverness, which is a growth area. They're largely inactive, so that poses a challenge when you've got identified housing needs. And really what that means is that for most of Scotland, if you're wanting to deliver homes, you need to take a different approach to land and development. Our argument and based on a number of bits of research is to do this, you need a proactive public sector that's willing to get involved in land and to de-risk sites. And I suppose what I would say overall is, yes, this is a challenge, but it can also provide opportunities. I think many people would probably prefer the houses and the placemaking in the second slide. So what I'm going to cover today, firstly, and Debbie's really covered this very well already, is just think about why land for rural housing is such an important issue. Why should we be thinking about it and talking about what we can actually do to deliver more developable land. I'm going to share findings from previous Land Commission work, including the very good work that Debbie and her colleagues produced for us, but also some work on the broader housing land market and how it operates. And then I'm going to share relatively recent research that Glasgow University completed for us, and the findings, but also proposals that we published flowing out of that research. And then I'll just make some brief conclusions. So why research land for rural housing? And there's really two big issues. The first one, this is actually a picture of Cromarty, where I live, and looking over to the green Freeport and the port of Nig. And as Debbie mentioned, there's enormous potential for mainly renewables and particularly offshore wind, but also other industries such as aquaculture, food and drink. There's the investment in upgrading the grid to actually transport renewables from more rural places to centres of population. And actually that provides an enormous economic opportunity and the chance for good jobs and long-term jobs and careers, enabling young people to live and to remain in rural Scotland. As Debbie mentioned, Highlands and Islands Enterprise have just done a bit of work to quantify the potential here, and they've set out that if things go as well as they could do, then over the next 5 to 10 years, over 100 billion would be invested in the Highlands and Islands, and that actually would dwarf the impact of the oil boom. So what we're talking about is something that's transformational for the area, but it's also hugely important for Scotland and for the UK. And then the second factor to mention is challenges around depopulation. And work Scottish Government have done on this really highlights that the bulk of areas that are really struggling as a result of depopulation and an ageing population are rural areas, mainly in the Northwest Highlands and Islands. And of course, for both of these, providing the right housing and a range of tenures of housing in the right places are absolutely fundamental. So to now talk about some of the findings from previous research that the Land Commission carried out. And one of the things we found around the pattern of house building, and this was actually us looking at the issue of whether land banking is in fact the issue that some commentators say that it is. But what we found was that in our current system, we've really moved to a place where developers do the bulk of the work, from identifying a potential site to getting the necessary consents, building out and selling. And this, given the time it takes to build out a site, but given the different permissions and tests that need to be carried out, this is time consuming and really expensive. And so what's happened, particularly since the 2008 financial crisis, when there was really consolidation in the house building industry, now most of the houses built in Scotland are built by large public limited companies. And so they need to make a return for their shareholders and make profit. And that's really led to them focusing on growth areas, but also looking to manage risk by building more on greenfield sites and building larger homes. And what that effectively means for much of rural Scotland is there's market failure. And so in a lot of the examples I've seen or case studies I've read, communities really probably by default more than choice end up, if there's going to be houses built, they're the ones that have to build them, and we'll hear more from Jonathan about a fantastic example of just that. I don't know how clearly you'll be able to see this slide, but it's from the work that Savills published for the Land Commission. And really what it's just looking to show is the relationship between land value and where house builders will build. And effectively in a city market where there's enough land value and there can be the volume of sales, that works. But as you go to progressively more rural areas, actually you come to a point where the cost starts to outstrip the sales value, and so you have this market failure. So now to talk about the more recent research that we carried out, and this really came about, our board wanted to revisit the issue of rural housing. We'd carried out the review of land for housing, and as I said, we'd published the research by Savills, but for the reasons I explained previously, our board felt that it was such an important issue and one where the Land Commission needed to work to make a difference that we commissioned this further piece of research. And really the objective was for Glasgow University to put forward practical recommendations, and we want those to be able to deliver a 10-year supply of land to meet housing need. And a key to it, I think, was that the land should be developable and deliverable, and that the proposals should be based on good practice and existing systems that worked. The research involved a number of workshops, a couple of in-depth roundtables, one in the south of Scotland and one in Inverness in the Highlands, as well as in-depth discussions with key actors. We also produced a number of illustrative case studies. I can't really go into all of these in detail today, but if you do have the time and interest, please look up the report, and it provides some really interesting detail on these case studies and really what the factors behind their success were. We deliberately chose a range of geographies, but also a range of scales and a range of promoters. So in the first example in the Isle of Colonsay, it was really the community trust that was driving the development. Also, they were working with a local employer, a fish farming business. A couple of others, it's actually the housing association in the area that's to an extent driven the development, often working hand in hand with the planning authority. And then in the final example, which is on the Scottish borders, it was actually landowner-led. So it's the landowner that was driving it and looking to deliver a development where volume house builders wouldn't get involved. But I'm just going to give a little bit of detail on a couple of the case studies. So the first one is an urban extension of Lerwick, the main town in Shetland. Shetland's a really interesting housing market because not only are volume house builders inactive, but effectively there's little or no private sector presence. But at the same time, as the chief executive of Shetland Housing Association will tell you, it's got the highest jobs to population ratio in Scotland. So there's real economic growth, there's demand for workers, and there's real need for housing to really sustain and enable that growth. So what happened with the development was the Housing Association took on this large site, and they undertook a bit of land assembly with land slots with the local authority, buying land from a private owner. And then with the council leading and Architecture and Design Scotland providing input, they master planned the whole site. And at the same time, the Scottish Government funded an infrastructure first approach. So it's allowed groundworks for the whole site to be undertaken as one contract. And it also means there's a clear master plan for the 300 plus units on the site that should mean it's a coherent place, and that the use of roads and cycle paths is efficient and planned from the start. Second case study I wanted to highlight is Bunbeg, which is very close to Oban. There was real demand for housing here associated with marine science and aquaculture. But again, it's not an area where volume house builders are active. So work really, the Link Housing Association drove this, but working closely with Argyll and Bute Council. There was funding again from the Scottish Government's Infrastructure Fund, which is very important because it's a challenging area, hard rock and quite challenging topography. But again, taking a master planning approach and risk sharing has enabled the site to be unlocked. And again, there's plans for over 300 homes to be built, and they're well into the build out. Baby's already given a really good explanation of Applecross project. I suppose the things really I would just want to highlight there are the importance of collaboration. So the fact that the Development Trust worked closely with the landowner, and as Debbie highlighted, the land use plan was then adopted by the council. And I do think it's a very good example of how even in a rural community, there's ways to pool resources and skills and reduce risk that's really enabled the development of the housing and some of the other projects to go forward there. And then in talking, I suppose, about good practice or case studies, I wanted to highlight this one with Highland Council because it goes beyond just a project-based approach to really find, I suppose, a more strategic or regional approach to unlocking land and enabling development. So in 2005, the council, they got a £5 million grant from the then Scottish Executive and match funded that with sales of surplus land. And since then, the Land Bank Fund has been used to unlock land for development of a mix of tenures. And as far as possible, the funding is then recycled when sites are either sold or built out and developed. They've been able to focus then support and development in areas of market failure. So they funded out a lot of housing in Inverness city centre, but also in more rural areas. And the council have combined this with other forms of enabling support. So they offer a pre-app service for developers, which has really been announced as part of the drive to support the coming economic growth and the need for housing. They run local development forums to bring key players together to solve problems on sites. And they also set up in partnership with the 5 Highland Housing Associations, the Highland Housing Alliance, which it can unlock sites, but also develops a lot of mid-market housing, which I suppose meets this need to support economic growth and to provide housing where volume house builders aren't active, but it's a different offer from social housing. So to move on briefly to talk about the recommendations and proposals that the Land Commission made around land for housing. The first couple here, it's really about public bodies being active in the land market and being willing to use their powers to buy and sell land for development. This would need a large-scale capital fund, but I think the example of the Highland Land Bank Fund shows how successful and how transformational this sort of fund can be. We also propose that public landowners should be required to review their land and identify surplus sites that could be used for housing. And coupled with this, that better guidance is provided around best value and being able to sell sites, not always that highest market value, but taking a wider range, a wider view rather around public benefits. And we've also highlighted opportunities that exist around compulsory purchase order reform, and Debbie mentioned local place plans as having a lot of potential. A little bit more detail on how we would see public agencies getting involved in buying and holding land. We see that as building on the success of the Highland Land Bank Fund, also using the role that the enterprise agencies, particularly HI and SOCI, have had in buying land to enable business and commercial development, but taking that role given how crucial housing is to future economic growth. We believe that working at a regional scale in the Highlands and Islands in the south of Scotland would allow institutional finance, but also funding from SNIB, who have been working closely on this issue. And yeah, as I say, I think the lead role would really be for enterprise agencies working with local authorities. On the better use of public land, we're aware that certain public bodies, and this is also true for non-governmental charities, are large landowners and often actually themselves struggle with recruitment because of housing challenges in rural Scotland. So we think that Scottish Futures Trust could undertake work and look at issues around the Scottish Public Finance Manual. And this delivery, I mean, there's no doubt about it. It would require a change in approach by public bodies. But I hope between Debbie's presentation and mine, I think given the scale of opportunity, the economic opportunity, but the housing need, hopefully persuade you that there needs to be a change in approach. So just to draw some conclusions, these pictures are really highlighting the sort of places that I believe there's real potential for public bodies to take in it, have a role in enabling development by unlocking land or helping with infrastructure. The two sites are Rainings Close, which is a great city centre housing development in Inverness, and the one on the right is the Shetland site that I talked about earlier. Just to highlight our report findings, as I've said, there's an absence of large house builders in rural Scotland, but actually coupled with that, and as Homes for Scotland highlighted, there's been a real decline in the SME house builders who used to fill that gap and work in some of the lower volume, lower margin areas. And I've just gone through the proposals, so I won't go through them again. Just highlight again, Debbie mentioned some of these, but there's I think a real building case for change. You know, the Land Commission have done work in this area, but there's been some major publications recently. Highlands and Islands Enterprise report just setting out the scale of the opportunity, but also helpfully clarifying the different sectors, but also the different areas where there's going to be growth and a need for housing. And what's noticeable about that is, okay, in some of the areas like the Inner Murray Firth, volume house builders probably will move in, but there's others areas such as in Caithness in Argyll and Bute where they won't. So there has to be another solution. And Debbie also highlighted the South of Scotland Enterprise report that's really looked at the opportunity for growth, but the challenge in housing key workers who might either want to remain in the area or actually move to live in the south of Scotland. And then a couple of reports that are really making the case that there needs to be a better link between economic policy and housing. One led by Professor Duncan McLennan, who's written a report for the David Hume Institute, and the second one by Prosper. So I suppose to conclude, this graphics may be a bit old now, but I always think it's incredibly helpful in thinking, I suppose, where we maybe want to be in terms of land market and planning policy in Scotland. It was from an RTPI, a publication that's sought to influence a previous Scottish election. And really down the left-hand side, there's what they characterised as the way the volume house building industry works. And down the right-hand side's a much more public interest-led development approach that could actually take a more patient capital approach and unlock areas where there's currently market failure. So this quote's overused, but I think sometimes it does apply. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thanks, David. I'll just start sharing my slides again. We do have another question that a good number of you have started to respond to already. Bear with me. David had asked, how can local authority planners support and enable rural developments? The vast majority of you in the room today are local authority people, as I know it's a few key agencies as well, but really getting some quite good feedback. Pulled out some comments about what might work. There's one talking about service sites, might be near to settlements, that might be a useful way to do it. As David mentioned throughout, supporting local businesses is one of the huge keys in the drive for economic development. Will have knock-on effect. There was a call up above for Scottish Government guidance to comply with policy. I think there is someone from Scottish Government here today. I wouldn't put them on the spot. So, yeah, I think there's lots of other parts about kind of early engagement and looking at how it can affect future sites, and looking at the wider picture. Again, I'll collate these into one big document, so you can all look through all the comments afterwards. And more are coming in. Oh. There's a nice one there on the bottom right of the screen. Be brave, fight for the right development in the right place. That is quite I've seen that in a few planning things, not always related to housing, but in planning in general, is that be brave approach and try new ways. And jumping back to what Debbie had in our slides before about the Clachan development as well, which was quite unusual and just seemed to be successful. Again, you may not have seen it, you may not have read the documents that all these are from, but I'll send these out afterwards so you can look into them in more detail. I don't know if anything from any of these have appeared, David, that you want to pick up on in particular, but
yeah, I think the Be Brave one's a really interesting point, and you know, it is a challenge. I think someone recently had talked about the period since about 2008 has been a period of permanent austerity. So I think in a way, public sector workers are always feeling they have to do more with less resources. But on the other hand, I think there's such opportunities and actually you know, doing this work and researching examples like the Highland Land Bank, there are some great examples. So yeah, I think be brave's a fantastic answer.
When we get to the Q&A at the end as well, it doesn't need to be questions. If you've got examples from your local authority, I know many of them have been listed through the documents that Debbie and David have brought up. If you want to speak about them in more detail for others in the room, that would be more than welcome. So again, I'll make sure we kind of run in time. So I'll pass over to Jonathan Guthrie just now to pick up in his presentation. The event is still open for Jonathan's question and anything you want to add to either Debbie or David. So Jonathan, over to you now.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me along this afternoon too. I don't actually have a presentation today, so you're just going to have to look at this picturesque face for the next 15 minutes or so. It's not Bonnie, I'm sorry. I just wanted to talk to you about being a customer of the planning service, the planning process. And that's not with my hat on in my day job, which is for Robertson Group, and it's not as the chair of the SPF, which I take over today, but actually is with a bit of a passion project for me, which was to join the Arran Development Trust as a trustee some years ago. Because I'd been going to the island on holiday forever, it seems, I kind of got asked if I would help with a local problem, which was to deliver houses for local people who both live and work on the island. And at the time when I was first asked to get involved in this, it didn't seem like a difficult thing to do. It didn't seem like a difficult process, but my goodness, it has been quite a labour of love and has taken probably a bit too much longer than it should have done. So the Arran Development Trust exists as a rural housing trust or rural housing body, and the intent of it was, and still is, to deliver those houses for people who live and work on the island. The idea being to create sustainable community on Arran. And I have to say that the trust has been superbly supported by North Ayrshire Council and also by the Rural and Islands Housing Fund, part of Scottish Government, who have seen right through what it is that we're trying to do and helped us from the very early beginnings as we kind of staggered to our feet to where we are now, which is having just completed our first phase of 18 houses and seen 18 very happy families all move into those houses just a week past Thursday, which was an amazing achievement by so many trustees. Me just in there as an advisor, I have to say, but the rest of them being islanders and putting full time into the trust to deliver these houses. So the history of this specific project down in Lamlash, which is in the south of the island, was around how do we develop a site that is a bit of a demonstrator, as it were, as to what we do in the face of a local authority report that said actually there was no housing demand on the island, and that wasn't a fault of anybody in the council. That was just a fault of the process that you go through to develop the ship, as it were, and to measure the housing demand. And yet we knew that there was a demand on the island, much of it hidden. So, for instance, part of that hidden demand was in local employers who were having to provide accommodation for their employees, otherwise they would have no business. Probably one of the most spectacular examples of that in terms of numbers is the Ochrani Resort, which if you've been to the island of Arran, you'll know. It's a very smart hotel just outside Brodick. And 40% of their rooms at the lowest and just over 50% of their rooms at peak times are occupied by their staff because they have no other option. It's either that or close because they don't have access to the staff, because those staff don't have any access to affordable places to live. Also, one other wee stat to share at this point. During the time I've been a trustee, the NHS have been trying to recruit local care teams on the island. They have had, or they did have, some limited success where they were able to recruit 6 members of staff. 4 of them left before the month was out because they couldn't find anywhere affordable to live. 1 of them left about 6 months later, having bravely camped in a tent. And then the 6th one is currently living in somebody's back garden in a permanent caravan. Because again, there is no affordable places to live on the island. The project looked to deliver 18 affordable units, and there are also 21 self-build plots on the site next door. And the planning status of the trust is quite interesting because again, North Ayrshire Council at the time we were talking to them about setting the trust up and what it was looking to do to create these sustainable communities, to give them sustainability in terms of their own economics, but also sustainability in terms of people, places to live, and also the usual things of corner shops and supplies was very much part of our focus. What the North Ayrshire Council did at that time as part of LDP2 was to word into one of the subsections, and I'll just read through what the subsections do. For those of you who are quite interested in this, it's LDP2, page 13, section G. Section G reads that they would support small-scale expansion of settlements on Arran for community-led proposals for housing for people employed on the island, where a delivery plan is included and infrastructure capacity is sufficient or can be addressed by the development, and where the proposal meets an identified deficiency in the housing stock and is required in that location. All proposals will be expected to demonstrate the identified housing need and that it cannot be met from the existing housing land supply. So other than the proposal meeting an identified deficiency, because as I said, it was felt that there was no housing deficiency, we ticked the box on every other part of that subclause. We were then able to demonstrate that there was a hidden need for housing through some of the employer-derived or employer-supplied housing, and that allowed us then to start to move forward with the first site. So the Rural and Islands Housing Fund came in with a 40% grant to enable us to secure the site, to secure designs, and all of our supply chain has been local, either in the Ayrshires or on the island themselves, with the exception of some of the construction materials which have been sourced from further afield, mainly for economic purposes. The demand on the island we were absolutely blown away with, because fast forward a couple of years to the point where we've got the buildings all up, the houses all ready for occupation. We opened our website to accept applications. Now, bearing in mind that these are applications that come from people who have a job on the island and don't at this point, or didn't at that point, have a house on the island. We were blown away that we received in very quick, as in within the hour, we received something in the region of 160 applications from families in need. We therefore closed the website because we now had far more than we could actually allocate, but we continued to get emails through from people, and we had another 160 plus emails from people who hadn't actually been or hadn't managed to make their application within the first hour. So that demonstrated to us that there was a demand of 300 plus, and it also helped us to uncover some further hidden demand from other employers on the island who had people who were renting rooms, who were renting caravans, who were living in substandard accommodation that wasn't even classed as housing. So we now have this ability to look forward and to see that we need to deliver more housing. And how are we going to do that? Well, what we're thinking of doing, or what we are looking to do right now, is to refinance the existing phase, the first phase, because that's now fully let with an income stream attached to it in terms of the rental, and then to release the grant that's locked up in that project so that we can then move forward with plots or phases 2 and 3. Phases 2 and 3 are quite interesting because landowners are very keen to help us to establish housing on the island for their families. So in many cases, they're not even looking for value for their land. They're quite happy to donate it to the trust on the basis that we are building houses that will forever be held in trust, that will forever have a rural housing burden on them, that cannot be sold as second homes or holiday homes, and therefore propagate the issue that the island finds itself with. Because on the island, the average income for a family on the island who are not in the public sector for their income, as in terms of schools or other council services, the average income is around £21,000 to £22,000. the average value of houses on the island ranges from between £300,000 and £400,000. So completely unattainable to people, particularly young people who live on the island. Part of the process was that we had to develop our own housing list because to put these houses into the North Ayrshire Council housing list would have meant that we were moving people with needs, particularly prioritised people and families, onto the island, an island where there is already a poor care provision because, as I've already stated, carers cannot afford to live on the island. So you're dependent on ferry traffic and ferry commutes for caring teams, which again, given the variable nature of the ferries, has been quite a challenge for many of them, and quite a challenge for families, particularly those with older relatives who live on the island. So our plan is to develop more, to develop phases 2 and 3. We've also managed to flush out from a number of the larger landowners and also the larger businesses on the island that they too would like to join in. They would like to give us a hand to develop housing for their workers. Workers who want to live on the island but can't at this moment in time because they can't afford to enter the housing market there. So our next steps will be to look at these next 2 phases to meet that demand head on by developing a programme approach to delivery. So that will be working with a fund, a long-term fund like we have done so far, where the costs are low and the objectives for repayment, if you like, of the mortgage term are much longer than the normal sort of 25-year. We're looking at our phase 1 as being a 34-year payback. But to do this, we probably need to take an even longer term view of that. We're also looking at sustainable materials and sustainable jobs to deliver the next few phases. So using locally grown timber from the island and then creating a sawmill and creating drying kilns to create the construction materials that we need to deliver the next few phases. And in doing so, creating long-term jobs so that rather than exporting round logs from the island as a low-cost export, the island will then be able to think about exporting high-quality construction materials from the island. So giving, again, sustainable communities, sustainable jobs, higher value jobs than perhaps the ones we normally think of when we think about a holiday island. But also the first phase has already started to create those sustainable jobs, because part of our ethos was to, rather than bring in a main contractor, which might find a bit odd given that my day job is with Robertson Group, but rather than bringing a main contractor to the island to deliver phase 1, what we did was we employed a clerk of works, and that clerk of works has employed trades to deliver these houses and bring supplies from mainland sources as close as possible to the Ayrshires in every case. And in making that decision, what we've been able to do is to train up a younger workforce in these skills of joinery, of electrical studies, plumbing and pipe work, etc. So they're now fully employed in the island because they're now also servicing some of the existing housing stock, because there was a real shortage of skilled trades on the island. So we like to think that we are doing our bit to deliver a sustainable community. It has been a struggle. I don't think any of us would deny that. But there has been a huge support from North Ayrshire Council and Scottish Government. The industry, in terms of the finance industry, is very interested in this kind of approach because they understand that whole nature of long-term steady income is much, much more sustainable than making a quick buck. So we don't deal with anybody that is looking at this as a way to make some quick money, because there is no quick money in this. And actually, what we've learned is there is a process here which can meet a demand, a local demand, but it's also scalable and it's replicable. It doesn't just work on Arran. We know that it can work elsewhere. But what it will mean is that they will need, those communities too, they will need the same support as we've had from their local authority, from the local planning teams, and also from Scottish Government planning and also Scottish Government finance teams. I think that's me. I think I've said what I need to say. I have to say it's been a bumpy journey, but actually the reward was seeing 18 families moving into homes where they've been living with parents or they've been living with relatives, they've been living in permanent caravans, they've been living in all sorts of odd places across the island, to have their own front door, their own garden, and to be able to enjoy the fact that they've got a sustainable future, because we are here as a long-term trust, a housing trust, not here just to turn over houses. So thank you very much for listening. And I think Trevor can share my question with you now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. I'll just bring it up on the screen. Jonathan's question was, how can we ensure that the planning system supports communities and their economic sustainability? Already having quite a few comments so far. There's a couple already in here on local place plans. And this one might be one that we can touch upon when we get to the audience questions and participation, is what good examples from local place plans have people seen that might actually help drive this? Are you seeing this? How can we share local place plans across communities as well, just so that awareness level is there? Perhaps a role for heads of planning and all of the planning authorities. There was another thing you brought up there during your presentation, Jonathan, on construction materials and what you brought over. And I think from it, there's a whole other webinar itself on new sustainable construction, not just for rural communities, but across Scotland. So that's something we might look into in the future. But yes, as you've mentioned, aligning promotion of jobs and tying housing to jobs as well, being key point. And there's a few other comments that I might not have expected. The greater floor size one, I would like to know a little bit more about that. I don't know if that's a particular example. And better understanding of local living too as well. I don't know if you've got anything you want to pick up there, Jonathan, from the comments so far. If you're able to read them, I'll scroll through them slowly if you want to go through anything.
Sorry, Trevor, I couldn't see my mute button there underneath that that pop-up slide. No, I think what is interesting for me is just that there's a whole bunch of comments there of all different subjects and all different topics. And actually, I think that is the approach that needs to be taken here. There is no one solution to the provision of local housing in rural locations. And I think, I can't see that slide, and where's it gone? Somebody mentions about the local place plans, and also understanding the local living and suitability, or suitably flexible tailored approach. I think that's the absolute key to this, is that that flexible tailored approach to specific locations and what can be done. And I think that's the only way to do this. It's taken a small focused trust the best part of 4 years to deliver 18 houses. Hopefully it won't take us another 4 years to deliver the next 18 houses. I'm fairly confident it won't, but it shouldn't take that long to deliver 18 families worth of accommodation. I mean, a small person can go through quite a bit of their school career in substandard accommodation if we're not providing houses more quickly than that. So yeah, that's what gets me up in the morning. I do have a day job, I do have an evening job, but actually this is the one that really gets me up in the morning, because I love doing that.
Thanks, Jonathan. David, I don't know if you've got any comments on any part of Jonathan's presentation, or otherwise we'll move on to the Q&A and audience discussion. So you happy for me to move on, or if you want to pick up anything? This is the big button to see if anyone's actually put any questions in here. No questions yet from the audience, but we have a lot of people in the room, and ideally if you want to stick your hand up, I'll bring you in. There were a lot of examples talking about local authority work. I know Debbie brought up the Argyll and Bute area capacity studies, and I think there's a handful from Argyll and Bute here. They might be able to fill us in on that as well, and kind of could that be transferred, and the kind of how that work's been done. So We'll just check the audience to see if anyone's got their hands up.
I've just thought of something I would like to comment on in Jonathan's. I mean, I think that policy that North Ayrshire Council put in is super, and you can see it was basically designed around the RM Development Trust, really, isn't it, or equivalent trusts, who have this ability to do this kind of community-led housing, and you probably have what's called a rural housing burden within the trust, so you can secure the housing in perpetuity for affordable, which is great. And then you've really got that whole mechanism going where, hopefully you'll be recycling money in. So it's kind of like, a really super model for what can work. I suppose what I'd say is what was really interesting also is that collaboration between the landowner and the community and the planning authority is kind of what we need to see both at the community level and at the level that David's talking about. And I'm really with David on this. I think the work that Community Land Scotland have done on, Scottish Land Commission have done on public interest-led development is hugely important. And I kind of think your RTPI slide that you showed, David, that showed the kind of list of how the house builder approach works and how a public interest-led development approach should work, was really telling, because I think it shows that our system at the minute is so adversarial, and it's kind of built on conflict. And I think that probably is why local authority planners feel probably under siege a lot from the private sector. The private sector feel deeply frustrated with the public sector, and we just ended up in this really poorly functioning situation, which could be broken through if we were approaching it with a much greater collaborative approach, and where planning authorities themselves were actually really planning for places. And we do have great examples. We do have examples of this across Scotland. So we just need to find a way to crack that and reduce the adversariality, no such word, I'm sure, of our system somehow. I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts on that.
If I could maybe chip in on that, Debbie, I think that's a really interesting point. And you mentioned master plan consent areas as having potential, and not necessarily just master plan consent areas, but I think the idea of maybe a local authority, if they see a need for growth or a site as being strategic, doing some master planning work. So you're almost, to me, that's almost helping to move it beyond that system that can exist for volume house builders, whereas it could almost be a bit of a game finding future sites that could be get planning permission and optioning them. So I get a sense that sometimes, well, not just a sense, but I think too much of the value ends up in the land transaction rather than in the quality of the place. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear people's views on approaches that could help with that land value capture, but also lead to more collaboration rather than conflict.
Can I jump in again on that? Because I think that's such a great point. And I don't know if it's completely bulletproof, but people often quote the kind of German model, which seems more collaborative, where the local authority or equivalent, whatever it is in Germany, they bring the master planning, they allocate the land, the landowner, the land comes in almost in a kind of partnership type approach. The local authority take it through the planning process, and then they sell the parcels off to developers. This is my understanding. And the money then comes back in and it's split. So the landowner gets something for the land. So it's not a nil-sum game, but all the risk is taken out of it for the landowner. So they don't need as much money to make up for the risk. The problem that you have now when you're trying to do the planning process is so ridden with risk at every point, and it's so expensive to do that you need a decent return at the end. Otherwise, you just wouldn't get out of bed for it. So I just really like the thought of trying to do that kind of system where it's collaborative at every level and everybody wins. And the house builders would win too, because they would get the building, they get the construction, and actually that would probably help to generate more SMEs because the scale would be much more manageable, and again the upfront risk would be so much less for them, so that lots of really good economic returns from that.
Yeah, and I wonder with that as well if it maybe picks up on Jonathan's point about development taking too long. And actually, in a way, I think 4 homes is really, 4 years is really quick to do the sort of development that you did. That's fantastic. But I get your point that actually you would like it to be quicker, and I think that more collaborative approach by reducing risk would, you know, I think partly would unlock more sites because more would be viable because the landowner or the developer wouldn't need as much return. But it would also just, it would bring much more certainty for everyone.
Yeah, I think the more certainty that we can bring into the system, then the less risk that is perceived and the less risk that is priced in. So every transaction through the process, from land value all the way through to construction and handover, will have risk dialed in, because there's always that problem of viability, and will it get planning, or will it get warrant, or will it find site conditions are not what they thought they were. So the more risk, or more risk we can reduce and more certainty we can introduce to the system, then the better it will be for everybody. But I do agree, Debbie, I think that collaborative approach is definitely the way forward. This has certainly been completely new and different for me in this particular project, to have a local authority and a government that are both so focused on helping the trust to get houses delivered. And remember, from the council's point of view, to deliver houses that their own policy is saying that they're not really required. So, there's some officers there who really deserve commendation for just taking that risk to help us and to work collaboratively with us to deliver that first phase and unlock the demand, because we now have very robust figures as to how many families are looking for houses on the island. So we have a pipeline we can deliver for them.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. We've actually had a few questions starting to come in on the Menti board as well. I'll read them out, and I don't think any of them have been labelled for anyone in particular, so please just jump in as you see fit. The planning system currently doesn't give weight as a material consideration to who the applicant is, whether they're local or an incomer. Should this change to support rural communities? I don't know who wants to be first up on that one.
I don't know if I'm answering it. I'm probably not answering the question directly, but going back to Jonathan's experience of the council-wide housing need and demand assessment not actually identifying need in that area, and it's kind of to do with scale, but also the metrics that are used. I do think there's something that really important which came out in that, an example of you need to be looking at local places on a scale. And, so for example, where I live in Cromarty, there's plans to build affordable housing, but I think the right way to do that for here is do a local housing need and demand assessment and really see what the community needs. So I suspect there'll be, hidden homeless where people are living with parents but wouldn't choose to. There'll be needs around key workers like primary school teachers. So I'm maybe not answering it that clearly, but I'm not thinking so much of the applicant. But I think for rural areas, you need to be nuanced about the sort of housing that's being provided and make sure it's meeting need. And I think often that need won't just be social or just for sale. It's often a mix of economically active people.
Thank you, Debbie, if you want to come in on that as well. Oh, you're still muted, Debbie.
Yeah, I think there are policies in some places that are sort of like what you're saying here, because I think Loch Lomond and the Trossachs either have or had a policy where there was kind of support for it being someone with connections to the area that was going to make it their first home, and whether there was a direct policy for that or whether it was treated as a material consideration, I can't remember. But I think it's definitely worth looking at in some local authority areas where the second home threat is much greater. That's one of a range of devices to be used to to try and control that, so it is actually going to benefit local people, and it is going to people who actually need a first home. I think that's hugely important. I wouldn't underplay the role that wealthy people, or even just well-off people, or even retired people coming into an area can do with mainstream market housing, because I think rural areas need that mix of people. We do need people with disposable income to spend in the local area as well. So being utterly focused on affordable, I think, is a dangerous approach to rural areas. I think we have to think about a mixed provision and how to do that well. But I think this is definitely worth exploring further.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, just to echo that, I think it's probably quite nuanced, the question, and therefore the answer, because actually on the island, on the Arran, holiday homes are not seen as the problem. Holiday homes provide employment. Lots of people are employed there, particularly weekends, for the changeover, as they call it, on the island. The one that is almost like the demon possessed on the island is the second homeowner, who's maybe only there for a fortnight in the year, and the rest of the time the house is known as a dark house or a lights off house. And because they don't actually come over to the island very often, and even when they do, it tends to be with a car full of stuff, so they're not really providing much in the local economy either. I think so. To sort of say is it an incomer or is it not an incomer is almost too black and white. That there are shades of grey in there, because a holiday home owner is actually quite welcome on the island at the moment, because that's where the majority of the employment lies.
Thanks, all. Quite a few questions in here now. I'll go in order. Next one is, what scale, location of rural development are you thinking of? It's not clear in the presentations given. Within a place of a few homes or a village? I don't know who was directed to. I think most of the examples, certainly the ones David gave from the Land Commission, it does touch on a range of places and a range of scales. So maybe we can move on. I don't know if anyone's comment on this, or we can move on to the next one. Jonathan.
I think in some ways these kind of projects are self-regulating, because if you're delivering houses for local people, you can't actually over-deliver, because you'll just not have any tenants, and therefore you'll have no income. So even as a trust, we can't take that risk of overbuilding too many houses that we then can't occupy, because otherwise, as a trust, we have no sort of core income other than tenants' income. So why would we build houses that we're not going to get a tenant for and therefore income for, so we can then pay back our mortgage? It's self-regulating in that respect.
David?
Yeah, it's just to say, I think it's all scales, really. The ideas I was trying to talk about are, I suppose, how public bodies or agencies can work together to de-risk development, but then you could be enabling 3 or 4 homes in somewhere in the Northwest Highlands that makes a huge difference to a community, or you could be talking about, housing that's more meeting an economic needs, like examples in Fort William and in Dunbeg. So it really varies, and the need will still be as important. It is just the scale of the place that varies.
Debbie?
Yeah, and I think when you start to think about the kind of smaller end of the scale, that's probably where you get the most challenged about provision. The cost of provision is high because you don't have the economies of scale. The planning process is expensive, just as expensive for 1 or 2 houses as it probably is for 18. Maybe slight exaggeration there, but it can be. We kind of groan sometimes whenever we have to do rural housing applications for people, small scale ones, because we know the amount of effort that has to go in, and the cost is so burdensome to the applicant compared to doing a large scheme, which is very expensive but proportionate, perhaps. So I think a small scale, and again, small scale always comes up against are there enough local services? So we get this kind of whipped with that existing position, whereas actually what we really, really, really are going to have to do in Scotland is accept it. the facilities are not going to all be there, but housing can quite frequently be the first mover. You know, you put the housing in place and other stuff does come. Whereas if you expect a pristine site with everything serviced and with capacity in the local sewers and the local school and a bus service all in place on day one, that's not going to happen for small scale schemes in rural Scotland. Something we really do have to be brave about. The housing can come first. It can come without the bus route or whatever, because that's how rural Scotland is and works at the minute. But if we don't start investing now, if we don't let the housing happen, we're never going to turn that around to the point where these services will be more economic. Instead, as I say, just the fear that we are feeding decline with our planning policies.
Thanks, Derek. There's no hands up from the audience yet, but please stick your hands up if you want to go in on anything. Let's move on to the next question on Menti just now. I see a huge distinction in what Jonathan described very worthy, and the bulk of speculative single houses in the countryside observation. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, because it appeared quite a lot within the first question that we asked the audience about the lots of single large developments was a fear of rural planning. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on this observation. Maybe.
Yes, and again, it is really difficult, because I do believe I mean, and I have lived in rural communities all my life, and the joy of rural communities is that mixed demographic that you get. You do get like well-off people, you get, and the mixing of people to me was always so much greater in rural areas than when I lived in cities, where you can be so much more in your bubble, your middle-class bubble or your whatever bubble. So to me, it's not that we want to ban well-off people from having a nice house in the countryside. I don't feel that communist about it. You know, I just think everybody has a contribution to make, and that fear of the big house in the countryside is what we come up against all the time, painfully, and the wider benefits of that are not being taken into account. I think we do have to challenge ourselves as planners. We can be very what's the word for it? We can be very social engineering in our attitudes, and I think we ask too much of the planning system to sort all of society's ills by not doing stuff. Whereas I think there's an awful lot of society's ills can be solved by us just letting some stuff happen. And I think all the stuff we talked about the benefits of housing are, you know, so significant to Scotland that we have to chill a bit about these things. That's a really bad term to use in a planning discussion, isn't it? Somebody else say something more sensible, please.
Jonathan.
Just so we know, I mean, I'm not really qualified to talk about this one particularly, other than the support that NEC gave us on Arran. That support is in section G of the LDP is only for where we are looking at agricultural land on existing village boundaries. So this is not about choosing some Highland Glen or something that's completely unspoilt at the moment and putting a big house in the middle of it. It's very much about just extending the existing conurbations, as it were. So maybe that's a way of distinguishing these sites. I don't know.
I'm still seeing no hands up from the audience. Just to remind people, you're not going to record any recording at all. I'll chop any audience questions out. So I'll go back to the Menti then. Sorry, that one's already been answered. Okay, the rural housing burden was designed to ensure primary residence, but there are no longer any market lenders that accept the terms of the rural housing burden. How else can communities keep homes in local use?
Did they mean? Jonathan will know better than me, but I can come in afterwards.
Just to say the way we've done it through on Arran is through the trust. So the trust accepts the rural housing burden, as it were, and everything that goes with that in terms of the houses will never be sold, they will never become a sort of second home, etc. And we borrow the money from the market. And actually what we found is many of the private lenders are less expensive in their interest rates than many of the public pots of funds. with the exception of the RIHF, which is a grant fund. But the likes of SNP, for instance, we found to be quite expensive because they want their money back in something more like a commercial term, whereas many of the pension funds and some of the more social funds are looking at sort of 30, 40, 50 years for their income. So they're just looking at some modest income that will grow modestly over a period of time. But again, as a rural housing provider, we have to ensure that rate, if you like, that income is not becoming commercial and therefore unaffordable. Otherwise, we've completely missed the purpose as to why we're here.
Thanks, Jonathan. Debbie, please go on.
Yeah, and it's partly just also to ask Jonathan, because I missed a little bit of what you said, that your finance, you have actually got private sector finance in as well. You've got a bank or a lender of some sort.
We do. So it's a 40% grant for the first phase. This is 40% grant from RIHF and 60% from private sector. What we're looking to do now is to refinance that 100% private, which will then release the grant funding so that we can move on to phases 2 and 3.
So actually, what the premise of the question is that there are no longer any market lenders, but you've found that there are those who will accept a rural housing burden.
We have, yeah, we have a number that we're working with, a sort of panel, if you like, of various lenders, and at the moment, again, working collaboratively. You know, we're not keeping anything secret from anybody. They all know that this is a spirit of openness that we're working, and they all know that we're looking for long-term, modest interest rates so that it keeps it affordable. So, I mean, the North Ayrshire Council affordability criteria is quite low in terms of its income. So we have broken out of that in terms of being, it's not social housing as such. It's more like a discounted mid-market, and that's working well, and it's attracted a few investors.
I think that's really interesting because the one place where I wonder if it would fall down, and you might struggle to get lending if you're a self-builder, like an affordable self-builder, maybe you might have more problems, but actually an organization like yourself with the kind of credibility, particularly having already delivered one, presumably means you can borrow more easily.
Yeah, the single thing that changed the mood music in terms of finding investors that were willing to work with us was the LDP2 clause from North Ayrshire Council.
Amazing.
The single thing that changed it, because up till then it had been knocking on doors, and I come from the world of finance. I'd been talking to some high net worth individuals. The interest rates that these kind of people were demanding was just eye-watering and eye-nipping, and would certainly not have delivered affordable housing. But because we then had that community purpose clause, as it were, inserted in for us by the council, completely unlocked it, because it was seen as being tacit support, although I would term it as more than tacit support from the council. We have not got to the stage where we need a guarantee from the local authority.
Wow. That is just an absolute classic example of how local authorities can make this stuff happen, isn't it? And probably everybody on this call is in the middle of an LDP at the minute, so you have this moment in time to put these great policies in that can actually then free up so much. It's such an amazing power to have, and that would be amazing to see that being replicated in lots of places, and that would mean organizations like your own can thrive, because at the minute it is a massive struggle, isn't it? Sir, and just one other point on that is we do keep hearing in Savills on a regular basis about the pent up demand for that kind of long-term investment in market rentals across Scotland, and mid-market rental or open market rental. And the big thing that's holding them all back from the minute is the kind of housing policies that are around rent controls and things. But there is a real interest in investing, and it's long-term investment. So it isn't this kind of give me my money back in 10 years type thing. It's, as you're saying, 30, 50 years. And to me, that could really start to help us unlock housing at scale across Scotland if we can kind of marry up these things. But the big role for planners and all of this is get the policies positive and give that de-risked environment.
Yeah, aggregating sites I think could be useful, because it would create a scale of investment for these kind of funds that are looking at this kind of social investment, long-term social investment. What it won't do, and I do keep on sort of just with some of my colleagues and some of my fellow trustees, just helping them to understand that actually it will not hide a poor project or a project that has substandard viability. That will need to be financially engineered to become viable before you can actually then add it into the pot. You're not going to deliver some non-viable projects just because you've got one or two that are viable. So it has to be done with that kind of eyes wide open thing. I see somebody's asked me the question about the cost of delivering each house. We haven't done the final account yet, and in fact we're slightly in a bit of a financial pickle at the moment because of a piece of infrastructure. I'll not name and shame, but a piece of infrastructure that has cost us £250,000 more than it was supposed to cost us, and we're currently going through a bit of a financial wrangle and refinancing of that particular piece of the jigsaw puzzle at this moment in time. But suffice to say, the delivery cost of each house is far more than it should have been, and certainly far more than an affordable house should cost. We used a palette of relatively low-cost materials that were very that were picked specifically for the location in Lamlash, and because of their local production or potential local production. But it still means that each house is cost in excess of £300,000. Which is far too much, and we're looking to get that down over the next two phases. Now that we know what we're doing, and now that we've set an established benchmark, as it were, and we hope that the ferry is a wee bit more, let's say, certain than it was during the build. We had on costs of around 1.4 million to the trust because of ferry issues. And again, I have to say that the Scottish Government have been very, very helpful at helping to support us with some of those additional costs and unforeseen costs due to logistics and the challenges of delivering on an island. And again, I suppose you wouldn't have that kind of support if you were building one or two houses at a time. It's only because we are doing this at a scale for our community.
Thanks for asking that, John. Just as you mentioned, there was a question in the chat. There's another comment in the chat, which is linking back to the last point. You highlighted the need for a collaborative approach between developers and planning authorities. What do you think is stopping that from happening, and what could be done to fix that as well, I suppose, if you've got any thoughts? Jonathan, I'll let you come in first. You're quicker on the buzz up.
See that's from a good friend, Craig. I think we've talked about this before, Craig, in terms of there's policy, there are guidelines, there's a process, there are application forms, there's all that sort of stuff. The one thing that's been quite difficult with some local authorities is the act of being able to go and have a cup of tea and just chat through the potential of a project. Rather than going to the cost of having to prepare documentation and materials and visualizations or whatever it might be to help to sell it as part of an official application process. So I think for me, what I mean, and Debbie and David might have other thoughts here, but what I mean by collaborative approach is that ability to sit down before you even know what the project is and just talk about the local communities, the local potential demand that might not be understood, and then starting to understand or work together as to how that could be delivered, which might mean setting aside some of those policies and guidelines, etc., and actually getting sleeves rolled up to do something new.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I suppose one of your points you've raised there is the lack of resources for local authorities to actually have that further engagement is something that the planning have looked at in detail. Is the fewer number of planning officers and posts now than there were years ago. So it's putting more strain on the whole system and maybe getting a bit less good results out because of it. David, I'll let you come in.
Yes, I may be coming at it from a slightly different angle, but I'm thinking back to the term Debbie used about public interest-led development and the point that someone in the audience made about being brave. So I think if local authority planners are more involved in thinking about shaping places, then they're already part of the the conversation. It was interesting work we did on Germany and the Netherlands, which are obviously very different planning systems, but it was pretty common there on brownfield sites for master plans to be developed, and it was the local authority working with developers and having design competitions. So I think, you know, in an approach like the Highland Land Bank Fund, if you're already helping to initiate and shape the development, then that collaboration's there, and that's hopefully reducing risk for developers rather than them being speculative about a site and having all the costs that we talked about earlier. And also thanks to Craig, it was his slide that I pinched for that RTPI slide, so apologies for that.
Debbie.
Yeah, I think both Jonathan and David's answers are ideal, really. And I think that cooperation thing, it's a while since I've worked in local authority, so I really do realise I don't understand the current pressures the same way I would have done a few decades ago, scarily enough. But one of the formats that old early planning departments early in my career had was that they had like 3 arms, which was like development management and development policy and implementation, good old-fashioned implementation. And the implementation team was all about like actually taking the LDP forward. So the LDP would have had, or local plans at the time would have had, you know, the actual proposals and things that could go forward. And sometimes that was, again, a place like Argyll and Bute, a lot of market failure. But some of the schemes that happened were early housing developments where the local authority, you know, stepped in, worked with the housing department to create a site for self-builders, which worked really well for, there was a really good scheme in Lochgilphead about 25 years ago, maybe 30. So I think, I'm not sure how local authorities are shaped up to do this kind of thing now. And I think we probably need to really think about the shape of local authorities, because the fact that we've gone to 10-year LDPs was maybe naively designed, wasn't it, to let local planners, policy planners, then be freed up to actually implement the plans. So I would be really interested to see what that looks like. And I think that could be a real opportunity to start this, you know, or use this partnership working collaborative approach. And again, the thing I can often be naive about, and probably need a development management person to put me straight, is that I feel development management is the mindset is way too regulatory. I still think as a planner, as a development management planner, you have a role in making good things happen in your area. And I think the best development management planners I've worked with have been exactly of that mindset. So the danger is that all the pressures that you're under in terms of time, and I don't know if local members still come around the desks and put pressure on, but I'm certainly live in my early career. Do you just feel that you have to be super careful all the time? Every box has to be ticked, every piece of paper has to be done, every policy, you know, where's what I would just love to see, and I do see, but not as often as I'd like to, is that kind of step back, go, is this going to be a good thing for this area on balance, and then support it to the hilt. And I need put straight on that probably, and hopefully somebody will pop into the box and tell me how naive I'm being. Not yet, but they will. No. The answer is probably too long.
I think we've touched upon this in the presentations as well, but I'll read out the couple of remaining questions on the Menti board. How can rural housing policy address the impact of second homes and short-term lets, which just supply and increase house prices for local people? Jonathan spoke at length about short-term lets actually having a benefit in Annan, but I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on this question. David?
I'm not a planner, so I'm not well qualified to answer this, but it's just an interesting point to me that I know in some other countries you have, you know, it's essentially separate use classes, so you can buy a home as a second home. So for example, the Danes will have huts, they call them, that they go and live in, but you can use the hut as a home, and you can buy a home. I don't know if that's even at all doable in Scotland or if it's necessary. But I think the idea of having, at least almost a different market is quite an interesting approach.
I know there's huge limitations on those Danish huts as well. A massive list to even get on board to get one. Sorry, there is someone has picked up, and I think there's enough examples around the country of the DM planners going out their way to make things happen as well. And if anyone wants to come in and speak about it, more than welcome. But I'll let Jonathan come in and pick up this question just now.
Yeah, no, I was just going to follow up on that. That maybe the answer to that is around the economic impact of what is being proposed. So, where short-term, obviously, if you have a superabundance of them, then that becomes a problem, even for urban locations. But at the same time, if it's seen as providing employment for local people in rural or holiday areas or beachfront areas or whatever it might be, then perhaps it's not such a bad thing, as long as there's not too many of them. I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about the planning system to be able to comment about how that would work and whether it would work or not. But perhaps that economic impact, I know there's an EIA goes along with many planning applications, but I don't know what scale that would be.
Sorry, losing where the hand is. I think the use class order thing is really worth looking into, but I have a feeling there was some research done on this a few years back. And I think Community Land Scotland, and I do mean that this time, did do some work on it, but I confess I've not seen the results of that. But I think the idea of a use class for second homes is a pretty good idea, really. But then you'd need to, probably with each local, again, it comes back to the kind of scale that you can maybe do a local place plan at, is almost deciding what's a viable proportion of second homes. So you are allowing a mixed tenure. We used to what was SPP used to say, mixed tenures, generous provision, etc. We've probably moved away from thinking about mixed tenures, and with the desperation to get more affordable housing in place, which is absolutely correct. But I just think that we might need to be more nuanced about, well, actually in rural areas you do need that kind of mix. And to be fair, the comment about the DM planners, I mean, that's great. I work all over Scotland. I have mixed experience. I think what I've tried to do is reflect the kind of dominant themes of what we experience as a planning team.
Trevor, for getting the opportunity to share. I did speak to the other trustees on the Arran Development Trust before coming on here to let them know. Very happy to share our experience of where we've got to, and if there are other rural communities and local authorities that are looking for a bit of insight as to what we've done. It really isn't rocket science, and it probably isn't new. It's just the way we've put it all together, I guess, that's made a bit of a difference here. But again, my thanks go to Scottish Government and to the North Ayrshire Council and everybody here for listening.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And exactly the same, as just such a great forum, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk and to hear from people and hear from David and Jonathan and everything they've been doing. Trevor, much appreciated all your organising.
David, who may have frozen on my screen now, so he might not be able to come in and speak. I'll just see if David's going to come back in, but just a quick word from you. Thanks everyone for attending today. There was a really good turnout. What I did mention throughout was I'll share the slides, I'll share a copy of the recording, and there's lots of documents being mentioned throughout. I'll share a copy of all these links as well, just so you've got somewhere to go, as well as what's been mentioned in the Menti boards. But thank you everyone for turning up today. I think we've lost David, so I'll pass on thanks from him as well. I'm sure he's more than happy to attend any of the sessions we run. So thank you everyone. If I could just ask my presenters today for 2 minutes, and I'll just say bye to everyone else. Thank you.